The stone remembers what the city has forgotten. Beneath the feet of every tourist, every pilgrim, every soldier who has walked this ground for 2,000 years, there lies a street, a real street, with real paving stones, worn smooth by sandals that belonged to people who saw his face. And if you press your hand against the ancient limestone of the Western Wall today, you are touching the same blocks that reflected torchlight on the night they arrested him. Jerusalem in the spring of 33 AD was not a painting. It was not a symbol. It was a living, breathing, impossibly crowded city wedged between two hills, and it smelled like blood and bread and dust and rain-washed stone. And somewhere inside it, in an upper room nobody thought to mark on any map, a man was kneeling with a towel and a basin, washing the feet of the men who would abandon him before sunrise. But to understand what happened in that room, you have to understand this city. Not as a theologian understands it, as a person walking through it would have understood it, with sore feet and dry lips and the sound of 200,000 voices echoing off limestone walls. You need to see it the way Peter saw it when he came in from the north that Wednesday, pushing through the Damascus gate with the smell of Galilee still on his clothes. You need to feel how small it was and how immense it felt. The entire walled city measured roughly 1 kilometer from south to north and 600 meters east to west. A young man walking briskly could cross it in 20 minutes. That is the size of the stage where the central event in human history was performed. You could fit it inside many modern shopping mall complexes. And yet inside that tiny footprint lived something so vast that the Roman Empire, which stretched from Britain to Babylon, had nothing to compare with it. 2 hills defined everything. The western hill rose to about 770 meters, and up there, behind thick walls and guarded gates, the priestly aristocracy lived in mansions that would have stunned a Roman senator. When Naaman Avigad excavated the Jewish quarter beginning in 1969, he uncovered a world nobody expected. Mosaic floors, frescoed walls painted in the Pompeian style, the same elegant designs you would find in the vacation homes of Roman nobility. Private ritual baths cut deep into bedrock. One residence, which the archaeologists simply called the palatial mansion, covered 600 square meters and had multiple reception halls, 600 square meters, for one family, in a city where water had to be carried uphill and every drop was precious. And then you descend. You walk down the slope and you cross into the lower city, the Ir Hatatit, as they called it in Hebrew, and the world changes so dramatically it feels like stepping into a different century. The lanes narrow to barely 2 meters. The houses are built of roughly cut local limestone, a stone they called meliki, and there is something almost heartbreaking about that word, because meliki means royal stone. The poorest families in Jerusalem built their cramped homes from stone named for kings. Families of 6 or 8 shared 1 or 2 rooms, totaling perhaps 20 square meters. The roofs were flat, made of wooden beams packed with mud and plaster that had to be rolled smooth again after every rainy season. And the smell in those lanes, cooking fires, animal dung, the sharp bite of tanning leather, pressed against you from every doorway. This is the city Jesus walked through. Not one city, 2 cities stacked on 2 hills, one looking down on the other, the priests above, the people below. And between them, running like a wound through the center of Jerusalem, was the Teropoion Valley, the Valley of the Cheesemakers, the Greeks called it, which served as the city's main commercial artery. Here is a detail that will change how you picture every scene in the Gospels that takes place on a Jerusalem street. That valley, which Josephus described as a deep ravine, has been filled in by 20 to 30 meters of accumulated debris over the centuries. When you walk along the modern street today, you are walking on top of 2,000 years of rubble. The original valley floor is buried 3 stories beneath your feet. The Jerusalem you see is built on top of the Jerusalem he knew, and above it all, dominating everything, impossible to ignore from any point in the city, stood the temple. There was nothing like it in the world, not in Rome, not in Athens, not in Alexandria. The platform Herod built to support it measured approximately 144 square meters, larger than the Acropolis and the Forum of Trajan combined. It was the largest religious enclosure in the entire Roman Empire, and it had been under construction since 19 BC. By the year 33, workers were still laboring on the outer courts. They would not finish until 63 AD, 83 years of building, and the finished temple would stand complete for only 7 years before Rome burned it to the ground. But in the spring of 33, none of that was known. What was known? What hit you in the eyes every morning if you were a pilgrim, sleeping on the Mount of Olives, and you turned east at dawn? Was the light. Josephus wrote that the temple's eastern facade was covered with plates of gold, and at sunrise the reflected light was so intense that visitors had to look away. He said it was like looking directly at the sun, and from a distance, the white limestone and the golden fire made the temple appear like a mountain of snow crowned with flame. That is what Jesus saw every morning of that final week. That is what filled his vision when he sat on the Mount of Olives, only 500 meters across the Kidron Valley, and wept. And the word Luke uses for that weeping is not the word for quiet tears. The Greek is ekleison. It means audible, convulsive sobbing, the kind of weeping that bends a body. The most spectacular religious building in the ancient world filled his entire field of vision, golden and white and radiant, and he wept over it with his whole frame shaking, because he could see what no one else could see. He could see the fire that was coming. Now picture the week before Passover. The permanent population of Jerusalem was perhaps 25 to 30,000. The city simply could not support more because it had no river. Every drop of water came from rainfall collected in cisterns, from the single intermittent Gihon spring, or from 2 aqueducts Herod had engineered to carry water from Solomon's pools near Bethlehem. 23 kilometers away, the low-level aqueduct followed an 80-kilometer winding channel along the contours of the hills just to maintain gravity flow. Water was life, and life was rationed. But during Passover, the population exploded. Moderate scholarly estimates put the number of pilgrims between 250,000 and 400,000. A city built for 30,000 suddenly held 10 times that number. Every rooftop became a bedroom, every courtyard became a kitchen. The lanes of the lower city, already narrow enough to block the sun, became nearly impassable. And all of these people, from Galilee, from the Decapolis, from Egypt, from Babylon, from every province where Jews had settled, all of them were moving in one direction, uphill, toward the temple. The main entrance for pilgrims was through the Hulda gates on the southern wall. And here the architects had done something remarkable, something you would miss entirely if you were not paying attention to your own feet. The monumental staircase approaching those gates was 64 meters wide, wide enough for enormous crowds. But the steps alternated between narrow and wide. 10 inches, then 35 inches. 10 inches, then 35 inches. You could not climb them quickly. The alternating rhythm broke your stride and forced you into a deliberate, almost processional pace. The architecture itself was a prayer. It was the building saying to your body what your heart was supposed to be feeling. Slow down. You are approaching the house of God. And you would have needed that reminder, because once you pass through the Hulda gates and emerge through the underground passageways into the court of the Gentiles, the sacred and the commercial collided with a violence that makes the gospel account suddenly, viscerally understandable. The court of the Gentiles had become a marketplace. Money changers sat at their tables converting foreign coins into the Tyrian shekel. the only currency accepted for the temple tax, because its silver purity of 94% met the standard. Every adult Jewish male owed half a shekel annually. Vendors sold pre-inspected sacrificial animals at inflated prices. The sound of cattle, the cooing of doves, the metallic clink of coins being counted, the shouting of merchants. This was the noise that filled the largest sacred space in the world, and into that noise walked Jesus, and he did not negotiate. He did not file a complaint. He overturned tables, he drove out the merchants. And the words he spoke were not a general complaint about commerce. They were a quotation from Isaiah and from Jeremiah, fused together, declaring that this house, which was meant to be a house of prayer for all nations, had been turned into a den of thieves. The priests heard it. They understood exactly what he was claiming. And from that moment, the machinery of his death began to turn. Along the southern edge of the temple platform stood the royal stoa, a basilica of such grandeur that Josephus said anyone who had not seen it had never seen a truly magnificent building. 162 Corinthian columns arranged in 4 rows, each column so massive that it took 3 men with arms outstretched to encircle just one. The central nave soared approximately 30 meters, higher than a modern 10-story building. This was where the Sanhedrin met. This was where the powerful gathered. And below this building, at the southwestern corner, excavators found a stone that had fallen 40 meters from the temple's pinnacle during the destruction. Carved into it in Hebrew were the words, "To the place of trumpeting to declare." This was where a priest stood every Friday evening and blew the shofar to announce the Sabbath. The stone was found lying exactly where it landed in 70 AD. 19 centuries of history, and it had not moved. I want you to hold that image for a moment. A stone that fell from the height of the temple and lay in the rubble for 2,000 years, still bearing the inscription that told a priest where to stand to announce the holy day. And then remember that Jesus said of this place, "Not one stone will be left upon another." The trumpeting stone is one of those stones. The prophecy is lying in the archaeological record, exactly where it fell. But we are getting ahead of the story. It is Thursday evening. The sun is going down, and somewhere in the upper city, scholars still debate exactly where, but almost certainly on the Western Hill, in one of those large homes with an upper room spacious enough for a meal, Jesus is reclining at a table with 12 men who do not yet understand that the world is about to crack open. The women of the household had been grinding grain since before dawn, barley or wheat, crushed on basalt millstones weighing up to 25 kilograms for 1 to 2 hours, just to produce enough flour for the day's bread. When Jesus later said 2 women grinding at the mill, he was describing something every person in that room had heard since childhood, the rhythmic scraping of stone against stone in the darkness before sunrise, the first sound of every day. The bread on the table that night was the product of that labor. And he took it in his hands and said it was his body. The meal followed the Passover liturgy. Psalms were sung. And at some point during the evening, 13 voices lifted the words of Psalm 118, the Hallel, the great psalm of praise that every Jewish child knew, the psalm that speaks of the stone the builders rejected becoming the cornerstone, the psalm that declares this is the day the Lord has made. And Jesus sang it knowing he was that stone. He sang it knowing tomorrow was that day. And then he knelt and reached for a basin. The foot washing was not a gentle spiritual metaphor. It was a shock. Washing feet was the task assigned to the lowest non-Jewish slave in a household. The Talmud is explicit. A Jewish slave could not be required to do it. A disciple could not be required to do it for his rabbi. It was beneath dignity. And here was the rabbi, the one Peter had called the Messiah, the Holy One of God, wrapping a towel around his waist and kneeling on the floor, taking the calloused, dust-caked feet of fishermen into his hands. Peter's reaction, "You will never wash my feet," was not excessive. It was appropriate. What Jesus was doing violated every social code in the room. The creator of the universe on his knees with a servant's towel. That is the nature of the love that was about to be nailed to wood. It does not descend from above with power. It kneels from below with a basin. After the meal, they went out into the night. John records that they crossed the Kidron Valley, and that single detail opens a window into the darkness of those hours. The Kidron Valley on the eastern side of Jerusalem was a place of the dead. Thousands of tombs lined its slopes. Monumental funerary structures, the tomb of Absalom, the tomb of Zechariah, stood like sentinels in the moonlight. Jesus walked past them. He walked past the monuments of the dead on his way to the place where his own death would begin, Gethsemane. The word means oil press. It was not a decorative garden. It was an industrial site on the slope of the Mount of Olives, where olives were crushed. The ancient process used a heavy stone wheel to break the olives into paste, and then massive beam presses with stone counterweights of 2 to 500 kilograms squeeze the oil from the pulp, crushing, then pressing. And in this place of pressing, Luke tells us something that has baffled physicians for centuries. Jesus' sweat became like great drops of blood falling to the ground. The condition is called hematidrosis. The subcutaneous capillaries burst under extreme psychological stress, and blood seeps through the sweat glands. It is rare. It is documented in medical literature, and it happened in the place whose name means to press. The olive is crushed to yield its oil. The Messiah was crushed to yield something the prophets could only describe in metaphor. And now the torches appear through the trees. Judas has arrived. And the currency of that betrayal matters more than you might think. 30 pieces of silver. If these were Tyrian shekels, and they almost certainly were, since that was the standard silver coin in Jerusalem, they contained approximately 14 grams of silver each. 30 of them totaled about 420 grams. That is the exact price set in Exodus for a slave who is gored by an ox, the value of a slave. But here is what stops the breath. The prophet Zechariah, writing around 520 BC, described a shepherd rejected by his people and valued at 30 pieces of silver, which were then thrown into the temple treasury. Matthew records that Judas, seized by remorse, threw the silver back into the temple. The prophecy was written approximately 550 years before the night it was fulfilled, down to the amount, down to the gesture of throwing the coins. Tell me in the comments, at what point does the accumulation of these fulfilled details move from coincidence to something that demands another word entirely? The arrest happened quickly. They bound him and took him first to Annas, then to Caiaphas, both residing in the upper city, in those palatial homes Avigad would uncover 19 centuries later. And here is where archaeology touches something almost too painful to look at directly. One of the priestly mansions excavated in the Jewish quarter belonged to the Bar Kathros family. The Talmud mentions this family by name, and not favorably. The ancient text condemns them for their corruption, for using their priestly authority to exploit the people. When excavators entered the Bar Kathros house, they found the evidence of its end: collapsed walls, thick ash layers, iron spearheads from Roman weapons, and the skeletal forearm of a young woman reaching toward the doorstep, frozen in the act of trying to escape the fire. The corruption the Talmud condemned and the destruction Jesus prophesied converged in a single room, preserved in ash and bone. By Friday morning, Jesus stood before Pontius Pilate. The location of that trial is still debated among scholars: the Antonia fortress at the northwest corner of the Temple Mount, or Herod's palace on the western hill. The Antonia housed a Roman cohort of approximately 600 soldiers and had towers reaching 35 meters, giving the garrison a direct line of sight into the temple courts to monitor for revolt. Beneath the pavement, Though the precise dating remains contested, archaeologists found game boards scratched into the stone by Roman soldiers. One was the Basilicus, the king's game, where soldiers would dress a condemned prisoner as a mock king for their amusement. They found the game, and the Gospels describe the game being played: a purple robe, a crown of thorns, a reed placed in his hand like a scepter. The stone floor remembers what the soldiers did for entertainment. The route to Golgotha was not the route modern pilgrims walk. The current Via Dolorosa runs 2 to 6 meters above the first-century ground level, and the path depends entirely on where the trial took place. But the destination has stronger evidence. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, chaotic and divided among competing denominations as it is, sits on a site that was outside the city walls in 33 AD. Excavations confirm it was a disused limestone quarry with rock-cut tombs, exactly what the Gospels describe. When the Emperor Hadrian deliberately built a temple to Venus over the spot in 135 AD, he may have intended to erase the memory. Instead, he marked it. When Constantine's mother Helena came looking in 326 AD, the pagan temple told her precisely where to dig. And beneath it, they found the tomb. Golgotha was beside a major road. Matthew records that passers-by mocked Jesus as they walked past. This was intentional. Rome crucified people in high-traffic locations because the point of crucifixion was not just execution, it was advertisement. Every person walking the road to Jaffa that afternoon was meant to see what happens to those who challenge Rome. And the timing of his death carries a weight that no Jewish witness in that city could have missed. The daily rhythm of Jerusalem was set by the temple sacrifices. The morning Tamid lamb was slaughtered at approximately 6 in the morning. The evening Tamid was slaughtered at the 9th hour, approximately 3 in the afternoon. Mark records that Jesus cried out at the 9th hour and breathed his last. At the exact moment the evening sacrifice lamb was being killed on the temple altar, the one whom John the Baptist had called the Lamb of God died on a cross 600 meters away. The lamb on the altar and the lamb on the cross bled out at the same hour, on the same day, in the same city, and then the veil tore. The naos, not the outer courts, not the public spaces, but the inner sanctuary, the Holy of Holies itself, was breached. That inner room was a perfect cube, 20 cubits by 20 cubits by 20 cubits, approximately 10 meters in each dimension. And it was empty. The Ark of the Covenant had been missing since the Babylonian destruction in 586 BC. For over 500 years, the most sacred space in the world had contained nothing but bare bedrock and silence. Once a year, on Yom Kippur, the high priest entered with incense smoke and sacrificial blood, approaching the presence of God in a room that held no furniture, no artifact, no visible sign of the divine, only the raw stone of the mountain and the faith that God was there. And when Jesus said, "Destroy this naos, and in 3 days I will raise it," the Greek word he chose was precise, not hieron, the word for the entire temple complex, naos, the inner sanctuary, the dwelling place of God. He was pointing to his own body and declaring it the place where God lives. The empty room was about to be filled, not with gold, not with stone, but with resurrected flesh. The prophet Daniel, writing around 536 BC, had said the Messiah would come and be cut off before the destruction of the city and the sanctuary. Both events, the crucifixion around 33 AD and the temple's annihilation in 70 AD, occurred exactly within that prophetic window. The Talmud itself, in Sanhedrin 97a, preserves an astonishing admission. The rabbis recorded their frustration that the expected time for Messiah had already passed. The evidence was in their own calculations. The timeline had expired, and they could not explain who had fulfilled it. I want to take you back to the water for a moment. Because there is a thread running through this city that connects stone and water and sight in a way that only becomes visible when you stand far enough back to see the whole design. In 2004, archaeologists Ronnie Reich and Eli Shukron excavated the Pool of Siloam, the pool where Jesus told the man born blind to go and wash. What they found was not the small basin tradition had imagined. It was a massive stepped pool, approximately 50 meters long, designed for hundreds of thousands of pilgrims to immerse themselves in ritual purification before ascending to the temple. The blind man washed in the same waters where all of Israel came to be made clean, and when he came up seeing, he did not just receive his sight, he became a living parable. The water that prepared Israel to see God had opened the eyes of a man to see the Son of God standing in front of him. That pool was fed by the Gihon spring through a tunnel carved 700 years earlier by King Hezekiah's engineers. 533 meters of solid rock, cut by two teams working from opposite ends who met in the middle. The Siloam inscription, discovered in 1880, still commemorates that meeting in ancient Hebrew. The tunnel still carries water today, a functioning piece of infrastructure from the 8th century BC, still doing what it was built to do. The water that opened the blind man's eyes had been flowing through that channel for 7 centuries before Jesus spoke his name. Water in this city was never just water. Every mikveh required a minimum of 40 se'ah, approximately 750 liters, of naturally collected rainwater. Archaeologists have found over 300 mikvaot in Jerusalem, many in private homes. 300 ritual baths in a city with no river, in an arid landscape where every liter was fought for. The obsession with purity consumed the city's most precious resource. And into that obsession walked a man who said, "If anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink." He was not offering water. He was offering what the water pointed to. The sun is setting now. It is Friday evening. The shofar sounds from the southwestern pinnacle of the temple, the priest standing on the very stone that will one day be found in the rubble with its inscription still legible. The Sabbath has begun, and somewhere in the gathering darkness, Joseph of Arimathea is rolling a stone across the mouth of a tomb cut into the rock of an abandoned quarry just outside the city walls. The body inside has been washed and wrapped in linen. The women have noted the location. They will come back Sunday morning with spices. The city falls quiet. The Passover lambs have been eaten. The evening sacrifice has been offered. And the one who was both lamb and priest, both sacrifice and sanctuary, lies in the rock of the mountain where Abraham once raised a knife over his own son. The stone of Jerusalem, Meleki, royal stone, holds him. The silence of the Holy of Holies, which has waited empty for 500 years, has found its answer. But no one in the city knows it yet, not the priests in their mansions on the western hill, not the pilgrims sleeping on rooftops in the lower city, not Peter, who is somewhere in the darkness, weeping with the same convulsive grief that Jesus wept over this city from the Mount of Olives. The city measures 1 kilometer by 600 meters. You could walk across it in 20 minutes. And yet it contained, in that single weekend, the hinge on which all of history turns, the death and burial and approaching resurrection of the one who said he would destroy the sanctuary and raise it in 3 days. He was not speaking of the stones. He was never speaking of the stones. The stones were always pointing to him. And if you are listening to this right now, and something in your chest has tightened, and something behind your eyes is burning, that is not nostalgia, that is not religious sentiment, that is the recognition that the God who carved a tunnel through 533 meters of solid rock to bring water to a city, the God who aligned the death of a lamb on an altar with the death of his son on a cross to the exact hour, the God who hid a tomb beneath a pagan temple for 3 centuries so that it could be found again, that God is not abstract. He is not distant, he is precise, he is personal, and the same specificity he brought to every stone and every prophecy and every drop of water in that city, he brings to you. Your name was in the prayer he prayed in that upper room, when he asked the Father not only for those 12 men at the table, but for all who would believe through their testimony in centuries to come, in languages not yet spoken, on continents not yet known. You were in that room, you were in that prayer, you were in that city, and the stones remember, even if the world forgets. If this journey through the streets of ancient Jerusalem has opened something in you, I hope you will subscribe to continue walking these roads together. There is so much more to uncover, so many more stones still waiting to speak. The city was small, the story is infinite, and we have only just begun to listen.